In Ardi Imseis, a Professor of International Law at Queen's University, who joins me now live from Ottawa. Ardi, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thanks for your time. So what's your assessment of this case?
Well, if true, it would amount to a war crime, very clearly. Civilians are not to be targeted. This would in effect amount to murder, mass execution of non-combatants. Unfortunately, this is not the first time this would, if indeed it's true, that this would have happened in the history of the Palestine problem. We need only go back as many of the Palestinians in Gaza, 70% of whom are refugees themselves from 1948. We only need go back to 1948 and the Nakba of that year, where Israeli and Zionist forces used such tactics, massacres, scorched earth tactics, ethnic cleansing, to get rid of the population. And so, if true, these events would be consistent with what we're seeing over the past 2 months, an attempt by the occupying power to deploy a level of force that is so widespread and indiscriminate that is aimed on at ethnically cleansing the territory of its Palestinian population.
And it brings into question exactly what the laws of combat and the laws of war allow. I mean, Israel has stated from the beginning that it is acting within international law, and yet human rights organizations would refute that, and they would say what we have here is a proportionality of 1,200 people killed by Hamas, and now something like 20,000 people and counting being killed in Gaza.
Yes, well, international law doesn't work that way, in the sense that it's never a balancing act between the numbers that are killed on one or the other side. And to be quite frank with you, the Israeli authorities, from the Minister of Defense and the Prime Minister on down, right from the beginning of this operation some 2 months ago, have been very clear, and this is the remarkable thing about it, that they have no intention of abiding by the obligations that they have as an occupying power under international law. For instance, those obligations include the need to respect the distinction between civilians, civilian objects on the one hand, and military objectives on the other. And yet, from very early on in the conflict, you had the Israeli High Command and IDF spokespeople saying that this war was going to be more about damage and not accuracy. Or, for instance, the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, calling the Gazans of the civilian population of Gaza human animals, and cutting off water, fuel, food, electricity. Starvation as a tool of war is unlawful. And then indeed, the Prime Minister of Israel invoking the Bible and the story of the Amalek to basically invoke genocide, which is exactly what happened to the Amalek people in the biblical story against the Palestinian people. And so these are the statements followed by actions undertaken by the occupying power, which do not augur well, certainly not for the occupying power's obligations to abide by international law. Quite the opposite. You have open admissions of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and quite possibly genocide taking place today.
And if we look at history, back in 1995, the Srebrenica massacre, eventually people were brought to boot for that. They appeared in the International Criminal Court and they were tried and found guilty of their crimes. How will this work? Clearly, there's going to be an element of time needed. The conflict hasn't finished. When could international law be applied to this situation on both sides?
Yes, well, thank you very much for that question. It's an extremely important one. How is all of this going to be enforced? The most obvious place where it will be enforced is at the International Criminal Court. Since 2014, there has been a situation, as it is called before the court, a situation in Palestine that has been opened. And since 2021, that situation has been part of an investigation. The Office of the Prosecutor, Karim Khan, is looking at things actively. There are some concerns that based on his public pronouncements over the past few weeks, that he isn't looking at the two sides fairly, certainly not focusing on the Israeli settlement endeavor, for instance, which is a big problem. But what we do know is that states parties to the Rome Statute, led by South Africa, as it happens, have placed the issue of potential genocide committed by the occupying power against the Palestinian people on the desk of the Office of the Prosecutor. So as part of that investigation, genocide will and must be looked at, and only time will tell as to whether or not the prosecutor will feel, when the prosecutor will feel that he has enough to issue arrest warrants and indictments. But make no mistake about it, The events that we've been witnessing over the past 2 months, that is the actions of the occupying power, massive indiscriminate bombardment, forcible transfer of over 85% of the population of Gaza to the south, ostensibly to push them into Egypt, starvation as a tool of war, coupled with statements of open intent to commit these acts, to commit these war crimes and quite possibly genocide, are unique in the annals of international law, certainly since 1945. And time will tell as to whether or not the ICC acts as it should.
Ardi, great to get your thoughts today. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Ardi Imseis there from Queen's University joining us from the Canadian capital.